Welcome to Connected by Health. I'm Dr. Krishna Vedala. This is where medicine meets leadership, innovation, and humanity with one goal: to add value and help change healthcare for the better. If you believe health is about more than a diagnosis, you're in the right place. Welcome to today's episode. And today we're joined by Ms. Poe Murray of the Newtown Action Alliance. Ms. Murray is a longtime community leader who spent her life dedicated to building partnerships between families, schools, local agencies, and law enforcement to prevent violence and strengthen neighborhoods. As gun violence continues to devastate our communities across this country, Ms. Murray brings a pragmatic, evidence-driven perspective on what works, combining grassroots organization, data-informed interventions, providing survivor-centered support, and formulating policy, and specifically advocating for policy reform. In our conversation today, we will explore how communities can mobilize for safety and healing and policy changes that can reduce harm at scale. So whether if you have been directly affected by gun violence, or if you're working in the field, or if you're just looking for ways to help, this episode offers concrete insights and hope. And please join me in welcoming Ms. Murray. Ms. Murray, thank you so much for being here today with us.
Well, thank you, Doctor, for having me on today to talk about this very important issue, during the National Gun Violence Awareness Month.
Mm-hmm. Yes, of course. Yes. And Friday, June 5th is National Gun Violence Awareness Day. And I believe, and please correct me, everyone's wearing orange, right? Is that true?
Yeah, most everyone.
Most everyone.
Yeah, our special color here in Newtown is green because that was the color for Sandy Hook Elementary School. So our, logo and our colors are green. So many of our community members will be wearing green to honor the, survivors and victims from here.
Mm-hmm. Well, please tell us a little bit about yourself and how you have gotten involved in advocating for gun violence prevention.
Sure. So regrettably, I am the co-founder and chairwoman of the Newtown Action Alliance and the Newtown Action Alliance Foundation because on December 14, 2012, my neighbor used his mother's unsecured guns to kill her while she was asleep and then traveled down to Sandy Hook Elementary School and hunted and shot 20 children and 6 educators with an AR-15. That shooting was devastating for our community, and we have been working for the past 13 years to honor the victims lost here, to prevent other families from experiencing similar tragedies and, having the same type of pain and trauma that we have felt over these years. So we've been advocating for policies to save lives. We've supported survivors from all over this country. We've organized a national vigil for all victims of gun violence that is held every December in DC. And we work alongside young people, lawmakers, community leaders across the country so that we can live free from gun violence in our country.
I think one of the saddest aspects of what we're dealing with as a nation when it comes to gun violence is what I think is the unfortunate politicization of it. And there's a lot of misconception when it comes to, I believe, efforts or any effort to reduce gun violence. And, we could talk a lot about political lobbying in terms of misinformation that's put out there regarding any effort to reduce gun violence. But what do you think are some of the common misconceptions people have about any effort to reduce gun violence?
Well, I think one of the biggest misconceptions is that gun control advocates like myself and many other organizations are trying to take guns away from people, and that's just not the case. What we're actually focused on is reducing gun deaths and injury, and policies like universal background checks, safe storage laws, extreme risk protection orders, and restrictions on assault weapons are really designed to prevent those type of violence to protect our families and communities. And this is a public health and a public safety issue, and it should not be a political issue whatsoever. And I think there's another misconception that gun violence is only a problem when a shooting becomes a national news. The truth is about 110 people die from guns every single day. 2/3 of it from gun suicides. So every shooting creates victims beyond those that are created by the mass shootings and those who are just physically wounded or killed. In our communities, families, classmates, coworkers, neighbors, first responders, and our entire community still carry the trauma. So I think it's important to know that there's a major ripple effect to every shooting, whether it happens here in Sandy Hook and it is worldwide news, or it's not being covered at all by the news outlets.
I was reading somewhere the other day. In fact, this is also going to be something we're going to be talking about in our episode that we're going to be launching on National Gun Violence Awareness Day on Friday, June 5th. But gun violence is now, or firearms are now the leading cause of death amongst children and adolescents. And that kind of just surprises me. It's not motor vehicle accidents or cancer, but actually gun-related violence, which I think is really a sad statement to say to who we are as a nation. And you've already kind of touched about this and talked about how Sandy Hook event has completely traumatized a community. But I think the issue is you said earlier, 110 people, right, die every day. And yet, despite all of this, why do you think it is that we're just not able to come together as a nation and come up with real solutions to address this issue? Or are we doing that, but even that aspect is just not promoted enough?
Well, there are real solutions. I mentioned some of them. There are policy changes. And while President Biden, was in office, he established the first of its kind White House Office of Gun Violence Prevention and made tackling gun violence a daily priority. He had tasked two gun violence survivors, Rob Wilcox and Greg Jackson, to implement the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act that was passed after the Uvalde shooting.
Mm,
There It was a bipartisan effort. It was not everything that we needed, but it was a step in the right direction. It
mhm,
funded community violence intervention programs. It reduced gun trafficking, made sure that there was expanded background checks for young people.
mhm,
And now what we're seeing is historic drop in murders across
mhm,
the major cities across the country. So we know
mhm,
that those policies work. So there are solutions. Unfortunately, right now, President Trump and his administration and the Republicans are resistant to, passing any common sense gun control laws. And in fact, they're in the process of reversing just about everything that Joe Biden did.
mhm.
And, those community violence intervention investments, played a huge role in reduction of murders across the country. So I'm just afraid that once, those funds are no longer available, the death rates will go back up again.
And you may not know the answer to this question, but why is it that? Why is it that one party doesn't really seem to be interested at all in coming together and actually putting together any real solutions to this issue? Is it a fear of getting campaigned against? Because to me, that never really made any sense to me, because I do believe that there is a lot of popular support for common sense, laws to help prevent gun violence. But yet I never really understand, and I think many of our listeners probably don't understand, why is there a fear amongst the Republican Party to even propose anything?
Like you said, the majority of Americans already support common sense gun laws. For example, over 90% support universal background checks. And significant number, like 70%, support assault weapons ban and other policies. So the American people are there, but I think the conservatives, the Republican Party, is using gun violence and a gun control issue as a wedge to build a broader base of support. And what they're misunderstanding is that, you know, that gun violence impacts everybody. You know,
Hmm.
there it does not discriminate, you know, between a liberal or a conservative or an independent or an unaffiliated. Gun violence affects so many people. In fact, gun suicides impact, many in the rural areas,
Hmm.
white
Yeah.
men.
Yeah.
So, I would think that if they truly cared about their constituents and their lives, then they would put the interest of their lives before the interest of gun profits. Gun sales have skyrocketed since the Sandy Hook tragedy. There are more than 400 million guns, civilian guns, in circulation right now. When I first joined the gun control movement after Sandy Hook shooting in 2012, there were a little over 300 million guns. So that is why gun deaths and injuries rose significantly over the last
Hmm.
decade. And then it was staggering during COVID when people went out and purchased more guns due to fear. And there was a significant number of gun deaths and injuries, but now we are seeing that decline, but it's not declining enough.
Hmm.
It went from like 50,000 to 40,000. And that's still way too many people dying from guns every single year.
We've already kind of touched base a little bit on this, but what policies or community-based solutions do you believe could end up making the biggest difference in reducing gun violence in the United States?
Well, no single solution, right, is going to solve the problem. We're going to need a comprehensive strategy and we're going to need all hands-on approach, from local, state, and federal government to get this done. But we need to reduce access to firearms by people who pose a danger to themselves or others. That's critical. Universal background checks, safe storage laws, and extreme risk protection orders are proven to do that. Safe storage laws are particularly important to us because they do more than prevent children, teens, and people in crisis from accessing firearms. They
Hmm.
also help prevent thefts. And hundreds of thousands of guns are being stolen from homes and seeping into the black market, right, into the urban areas, causing significant problems in the cities. And it creates a vicious cycle of fear that the gun lobby uses to get folks like me and you, if we live in suburban areas, to purchase guns.
Hmm.
Because they tell you you need a good guy to stop a bad guy with a gun. So
Yeah.
there's quite a bit of racism involved in the whole fear rhetoric that's
Hmm.
being pushed out by the gun industry and the gun lobby.
I think the other question that's always kind of lingered in my mind is, how do you approach this, right? How do you approach someone who may not agree with you? And keep in mind, passions run pretty strong sometimes, and especially maybe too strong, especially with someone who has access to guns, who possesses guns. And so how would you say you could approach conversations about gun violence prevention with people who very strongly support gun rights?
Well, yeah, I've met with very conservative members of Congress in the House
Mhm.
and the Senate over the last 13 years. But my conversations typically start with stories and shared values. I think we can agree that we want our children to be safe. We want our schools to be safe. We want our families to be protected, in our homes and in the streets and in public venues. And most people agree with that,
Mhm.
right? And what we're trying to do is prevent the tragedy before it occurs.
Hmm.
And I think we can agree on that, but unfortunately, there's been so much rhetoric pushed out by the other side. It's really
Mhm.
hard to come to a place where Senate Republicans or House Republicans find themselves courageous enough to vote for gun control bills. But they have shown that they can. In 2022, after the Uvalde shooting, I mentioned the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. We passed that bill with 15 Senate Republicans and 14 House Republicans supporting that bill. Like I said, it wasn't enough, but it was a great start. We broke the dam, but it really matters who will be representing us, in the state houses and on Capitol Hill, because they can make or break the gun control laws passing.
This is something that I always like to say. Gun violence is now America's major public health nightmare, and we all have to come together to do something about it. And you hit the nail in the coffin. We're just trying to save our children, right? We're trying to save our future. Basically, we're pro-life, right? We're trying to save lives at the end of the day by doing this. And I think and many others who are listening are always probably going to be just dumbfounded about why it has to be such a major initiative just to get a few votes, just to try to protect our children. And I think that's something, and you've explained it very well. There may be lobbying and there may be fear of retribution, but that really should never prevent us from doing the right thing, right? But what actions do you think ordinary people can take, just beyond just social media posts, to really help address gun violence in their own communities?
I think first, we have to remember that we have lost many of our other rights,
Hmm.
because of the Second Amendment, which was really a group right, and it was individual right to own a gun really did not exist until the Heller decision
Hmm.
in 2018. So for hundreds of years, it was known that it was a group right.
Yeah.
So I want people to understand that we have the right to live free from gun violence. Okay. That's really important, but there's so much more that people can do. They can contact their elected officials, to advocate for policies. They can attend town halls, school board meetings, community forums. They can volunteer with organizations that exist in their communities, to prevent gun violence. And they can simply talk about gun violence with their friends and family and neighbors and not make it something that we shouldn't talk about or
Hmm.
that it's political. I mean, it's not a political issue, as we discussed earlier. So it's really important that people participate in educating their community members about the risks associated with bringing guns into our homes.
Hmm.
Studies after studies show that bringing our guns into our homes double our risk of homicides and
Hmm.
it triples our risk of suicides.
Hmm.
And a woman in a domestic violence situation is 5 times more likely to be killed if there's a gun present.
Hmm.
And, those are the risk factors that we need to be aware of before bringing guns into our homes. But, policy change will only occur if we vote.
Yeah.
And we need to make sure that we vote for gun safety champions, who are willing to put our lives first before the profits of the gun industry.
Yeah.
That is just really crucial. And I mean, I worked as a physical therapist, and I, you know, took time out to raise my children, and I became an advocate leading a national gun control organization. If somebody like me, an ordinary person, can make an impact, then others can do the same.
One of the things that we always hear every time there is, unfortunately, another mass violent shooting, which happens quite often these days in the United States, there's always this statement, which is now is not the appropriate time to talk about policy and politics, but rather just to sympathize with the victims. And I don't think anyone is ever denying, to sympathize with the victims. But if not during those moments, when would you say would be a better time to talk about gun violence reform?
Yeah, we've heard that so many times, right? And every time there's a significant mass shooting that's in the is major national news, you
Yeah.
see elected officials sending thoughts and prayers and not taking any action. So our slogan, our hashtag has been honor with action from day one, right?
Yeah.
It's meaningless to send thoughts and prayers when so many people are suffering and we know the policies
Hmm.
that can prevent tragedies and do nothing about it. So it's really important for us to push back against thoughts and prayers and make sure that we demand action. And not only from, elected officials, but we also need to hold each other accountable as well to do more. Sitting back and being apathetic or thinking that gun violence can't reach your family or yourself is not the best way to move forward to protect your families and yourself.
Well, Miss Murray, thank you so much for being here today and answering all of our questions. And thank you for everything you do. And we really appreciate you fighting the fight to bring in common sense gun control and to prevent further gun violence. Before you leave, do you have any words of wisdom for any of our listeners who are passionate about advocating for gun violence prevention?
Yeah, I just want to tell your listeners to don't underestimate their power of their voice and their vote. It's so important to communicate with their elected officials, and it's also so important to vote for candidates, like I said, who will support gun violence prevention measures. It's
Hmm.
crucial. I mean, there are 400 million guns in this country, and there are more AR-15s than ever before after the first assault weapons ban expired.
Hmm.
So, we just need to make sure that our elected representatives do their job. It's their job to protect us because we have the right to live. That's enshrined in the Constitution as well. So, you know, we need everyone to advocate as much as they can and don't be apathetic.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And to all of our listeners, this has been your podcast, Connected by Health. At the end of the day, gun violence is no longer just a political issue. This has become a public health issue. It is America's public health disaster. And we all need to come together, put aside politics, put aside fear. And we're not doing this for the sake of making a point, but we're doing this to save the future, to save our children. And for all of you listening, thank you. And please take the words of Miss Murray and start advocating for gun violence prevention. And thank you so much for listening to us. If you found this conversation valuable, share it with someone who could use it. And if you're on Apple, we'd love to hear your favorite takeaway and a review. See you next week.